Hello, my name is Justin Keefe. My email address is jkeef005@fau.edu. This video is for the Senior Project 4911 summer class. Our group is EFTT, that is working on a trending trade algorithm. This is one of our two algorithms. This particular video is about part one of a four-part series about our Big Daddy Rubber Band Expert. And this specific video pertains to the head and shoulders signal, the one I developed and worked on. We have another signal called the forest algorithm that's in a different video. The explanation is there, but this is part one of four. We separated it into four videos because there's four signals that are used in it, and we wouldn't have enough time within our time frame to be able to explain all four with code explanations too within one video. So we separated it into four videos. This is part one. Once again, head and shoulder signal. So the four signals, as I mentioned, are double top and bottom, SJY, head and shoulders, and the moving average. Each one we put a different weight, assigned a different weight based off of two factors, based off of our theory approach to it, and based off of what we tested and what we practiced, what worked best for us. We set the double top and bottom to weight to 0.4 and the head and shoulder weight to 0.5. The reason we set these two weights lower than the other two was because these signals more work on guesswork. It more pertains to like, hey, a head and shoulders pattern. We see a head and shoulders pattern. I think there's a head and shoulders pattern. I perceive there's a head and shoulders pattern. I think I should sell. But you might see the same thing and think, oh, no, that's not a head and shoulders. I don't want to sell. There's no exact 100% metric to, identify head and shoulders. I could think it's a head and shoulders, but you might not. So that's why we set these weights a little lower. These double top and bottom head and shoulders also take a while to develop a signal, like to develop a pattern, so we put them as a little lower weight so they wouldn't interfere with the ones that happen more frequently. They wouldn't be telling them, no, 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 we don't see any pattern happen because ours takes so long to develop, and that's always going to interfere with the other two. So that's why we set those as lower weights. The SJY is built off of the moving average, is an extension of the moving average. That's why we gave it the highest weight. And moving average comes from MetaEditor itself. And we gave that one to 0.6 because that one happens a little more frequently within our chart. So yeah, that is the explanation of our different weights we have. Now, let me go to this is one I've already generated, but I'll regenerate it so you can see how it performs. This is on the course of 2018, the whole year for the pound in the dollar on the H4 chart. Now let's let this finish testing in progress. Okay, and the back test, we see we won about $738. We had about a 50% win rate on short trades and long trades, which isn't bad because since we have a smaller stop loss level than we do a take profit. So if we're winning 50% of the time, we're making money, which is why, as you can tell, we made $738. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of charts here, a lot of explanation, but let me configure the chart so I can show you better how the head and shoulders performed in this. Before I got into showing you the chart, I just wanted to do a critical rundown. A head and shoulders works on there's two types. There's an inverse head and shoulders and there's a regular head and shoulders. The way the regular head and shoulders works is you have a peak, then a trough, a higher peak, and then a trough, and then you have a lower peak, and then a trough. Similar to a head structure, your head's higher than your two shoulders, and then the neckline connects all the troughs at the bottom. And at the end of the head and shoulders, when you see a head and shoulders pattern, you want to sell, because that's what you think people are going to do when they see a head and shoulders, is they're going to sell. So you sell. Then there's also the inverse head and shoulders, which is the exact opposite. You have a trough, a smaller trough, a bigger trough in the middle, and then you have a smaller trough on the end, making a head and shoulders just flipped. And when you see an inverse head and shoulders, you want to buy. I just wanted to explain this before I got into the chart. Okay, right here we have a good example of a head and shoulders pattern that the signal did detect and did buy upon. We have a left shoulder right here, then we have a big head, and then we have a right shoulder. And then see here, we sell here along the breakthrough line, which would be about right through here. We have the breakthrough line right about here, and that's where we would want to sell. And that's why this indicator opened up a sell purchase here. And now I'll show you an example of an inverse head and shoulders pattern that happened. As I said before, head and shoulders, things can get a little messy sometimes, because it's not always the ideal situation where you have a beautifully both shoulders are the same size and then the head's a different size. So right here, we have a left shoulder for an inverse head and shoulders, we have a head, and then we have a smaller right shoulder. And then we have a buy purchase. Let's see, if we look at the breakthrough, the neckline would be right across here. Right across about here. And then we open a buy order once we hit through that neckline because we think that people are going to start buying, so we open up a trade right away. Those are two examples, one of a regular head and shoulders and one of a reverse head and shoulders. Now I want to get into a little bit of the coding side of it, so you can see from the coding side of it. Later I'll go into more examples. I have many more examples in even that chart that opened up a head and shoulders that opened up correctly. But now let me get into the code. First of all, the input parameters are set in this header file. This header file sets all the input parameters that the expert advisor needs to run in a general case, because we're making this algorithm more for a general buyer that they wouldn't go in and mess with the inputs. So see, these are the most general inputs that would make the trading signal work across the most charts. Then we have the head and shoulders pattern. The head and shoulders pattern helps us to this helps us to detect the head and shoulders patterns. It builds upon the pattern class that is over here, builds upon this pattern class, and helps us to detect specifically a head and shoulders pattern. Okay? The major functions that are powering this signal, the first one is in the CHS pattern, or in the HS pattern file, is the search. What this search does is tailored towards a head and shoulder pattern and checks different externums. Externums are peaks, highs, and lows, essentially. So that's what we need to detect our shoulders, we need to detect our head, we need highs and lows in the chart. So what this does is it searches through all the externums that are currently found to try to see if a pattern has formed. And as you see, we set up parameters, check for the pattern in normal or reverse or inverse head and shoulders pattern, and then we return if we found a pattern or not. If we found a pattern, we return that, and then we use that later on. One of the other most important functions in this HS pattern is the check signal. Now the check signal, what it essentially is doing is telling us whether we should buy or we should sell. So essentially it's saying whether we should have a reverse head and shoulders or an inverse head and shoulders. And it uses stop loss, take profit, and it passes them all as reference, and essentially checks whether what we should do. And it also returns the neckline. This is used so we can set stop loss and take profit. We don't set stop loss and take profit in ours, but what we do when we set this, when mine is saying the stop loss and the take profit, it's checking that with the neckline set where it is, will it be worthy to start a trade now? That's what the check signal does in the buy or the sell direction. So it evaluates the neckline and the stop loss and the take profit to make sure that it's worthy to open up a trade. It returns true because all the variables are passed by reference. So that is one of the major functions. And it returns a 1 if you should buy and a -1 if you should sell in this signal value. And then the stop loss is set here, the take profit 1 and take profit 2 are set there. Now, when we go into the actual signal of the class called signal head underscore shoulders.mqh, we have five different result values in these pattern values. Pattern is found, no pattern is successful, pattern is we should go short, we should go long, and the placeholder for a pattern. So those values are all set here. We have this init head and shoulders. We don't use an indicator, but this is used to initialize what we need for the head and shoulders to work properly. We initialize it here with init indicators. Then we have some major functions. We'll pass through those for now, and we'll go to check pattern buy and check pattern sell. Essentially what these both do the same thing, just in reverse, one for buying and one for selling. Now this one with check pattern buy is used for a reverse head and shoulders, And what happens is if the signal equals, we run the check signal. If the check signal returns false, like we talked about before, then that means there's no pattern present and there's no reason to run this. Or the pattern wasn't valid, we didn't like the pattern, and we return false, we exit right out. Then what we do is if we do get a 1 for the signal, we have this case 1. What this case 1 is doing is for a reverse head and shoulders checking whether, with what the values for take profit are set to, what the values of stop loss are set to, whether it's worthy to open a trade. Essentially, if they're not in line with the neckline, then we exit out right away because there's something wrong with our pattern. Something's malformed within our pattern and we don't open a trade up. And then we return false. If we do have a trade, we return false because that removes the trend from our algorithm, that removes the pattern from our algorithm, so we don't keep processing the same thing over and over again. So we return false. If we didn't find anything, we return true. The same thing happens with check pattern sell, except the signal returns a -1. But very, very similar. I just split them up to make them more readable for the next set of programmers who come in. But essentially, what this is doing is checking the signal. If we return a false, that means, hey, there's a pattern. But we're going to remove that pattern so it's not getting processed for later. In this long condition, which is also in the signal class, what this is doing is telling us whether we think the price will go, aka a reverse head and shoulders. So what we do first is we check to make sure there's enough time for a bar to happen. We check and then if there's not enough time, we return false. Or we exit, we set it that there's no pattern, and we return 30 for the value. Then we check the previously saved patterns. We check, we evaluate them and see if there's a check pattern sell, then we exit out. We check pattern sell because that would mean it's that we actually were looking at a regular head and shoulders instead of a reverse head and shoulders, and that's why we make sure that that returns false for check pattern sell. Because if the pattern returns for a regular head and shoulders, we don't want to process a long condition. Okay, then we search for new patterns in real time. We check to see if there's any patterns. If there's no patterns formed, we return. We then start our search. We also come here and we record the time and start a new pattern if we found there's enough time for there to be a pattern. We then search through the pattern in loops to see if all the values we have saved up for patterns, if all of them match and we find this pattern, which goes back to the pattern.search, which we then, well, what we do is we check to search if there's a pattern. If there is a pattern, we then break out of the loop. We say if we found a pattern. We check if the pattern matches for buy using the check pattern buy that we talked about earlier. And then we set the result as, hey, there's a buy pattern. And then we exit out. And then that tells the expert advisor, hey, we should open an order here. For check short condition, it works in the very similar way. We're not going to get into it in this video because of time constraints on Screenomastic. I might have to make a second video, but short condition happens very similarly, but in the opposite way. It's for a regular head and shoulders pattern. Now all this works in our BigDaddyRubberBandExpert. It runs it itself. Now let's get back to MetaTrader so we can look at some other trades that happened because of the head and shoulders. Here we have an example of another head and shoulders that opened the sell. We have a left shoulder here, a head, a right shoulder, and then right once it got to the bottom, we opened up a trade to sell. We have the neckline would be about down to here. It's a little, head and shoulders can get a little weird with the necklines, because not every pattern is ideal. But that's an example. It opened the sell right at the bottom when it should, and that would give us a seller. We have one more teeny tiny little pattern that was also detected. This is for reverse head and shoulders. We have a shoulder, a head, another shoulder, and then we open a buy. And this is about all the time we have. I hope this explanation helped explain to you how the head and shoulders is contributing to the signal. This is a 4-part series, as I mentioned, and this is just the head and shoulders part. If there's anything here, I will post my information one more time. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Have a great day, and yeah.